Okay, so I got my new piston rings slid on my piston here, and the top ring has a gap towards the back because it's the rear piston. It's towards the direction the arrow is pointing. The second spring is the opposite way, and then the oil rings, each section of the oil ring is just offset from itself, going this way. So just offset a little bit more, next one a little bit more. I have my base gasket ready to go. I didn't have a base tool, so I just put a couple pieces of UHMW that I had laying around under the piston just to keep it square while I slide the cylinder on. The piston rings are lubed up with some assembly lube. The skirt on the piston has a thin coat of moly grease on either side. My rear cylinder has a bit of engine oil swished around the inside there, the sleeve, so that's ready to get thrown on there. Now I don't have a piston ring compressor to compress these springs, so I'm just going to try and do it by hand as I slide the cylinder down. See how that works. Just like that. I can pull these blocks out of here that was keeping the piston square while holding this flywheel. I'm just gonna slide this cylinder down onto its base gasket, and then I'll tighten up some nuts here. So I got two nuts in here and one cap nut right there that need to be torqued to 18 foot-pounds. Now for this one, I can't get my socket on it, but I got this crowfoot wrench adapter that'll stick in there, and normally you need to compensate for this offset here when you're using your torque wrench, but I don't think I'm going to bother. I think I'm just going to torque it with that, and it'll be a little bit more, but that should be okay. Okay, it's going to be the same procedure for the front cylinder. The only difference being it has this little pipe that goes between the cylinder and the case. So that just sits in there. This little rubber doohickey, and that's good to go. Whoops. This rubber hose, I had it the wrong way. I had the long way up. The long tapered end should be down. It should be just the nub end sticking up, so it'll feed into the cylinder correctly. Mistakenly put my flywheel on, so I just loosen that nut and I'll pull that back off. Okay, so I'm going to set up the cam chains for the front cylinder first. I have my front cylinder at top dead center. So there's a mark on the crankshaft gear, and it lines up with a mark here on the case, and that's where I need that to be when I install this intermediate shaft and chain. On the intermediate shaft there's a little mark, and there's also some paint marks on my chain, and the paint marks are there, and there's another one here, and in between the paint marks is 38 pins, chain pins. So if you don't have marks, you can count them off. So my 38th one would be just to the left of this mark, and number 1 would be just to the left of this mark. So when I slide this intermediate shaft into its home up here. I'm going to bring that chain around, wrap around, and I'm going to mark, or I'm going to line this mark in the chain up with the mark on this gear, and when it's in line with that crankcase mark. Should also note that the upper chain needs to be slid on this intermediate shaft before it gets slid into place as well. So with that mark lined up on the crankshaft properly, I'm going to just slip my intermediate shaft sprocket into place. Okay, I got my shaft slid in there. I should note that there was a little bit of moly grease on that when it went in. Now I'm just going to put my retaining plug or bolt, whatever you want to call it, in there. Tighten that up with a quarter. Perfect. Okay, the next step is to install the chain guides. First one I'll put in is the front cylinder, front lower chain guide, and it has an F for front, so you can distinguish it from the rear cylinder one. And I'm just gonna slide it in that direction from the top until it seats. Then I'll grab my bolt with my washer, put a little bit of Loctite on there, and thread that guy in right there. And then I'll put the front lower rear chain guide in place. And same thing, Loctite on the bracket bolts. Okay, for this spring tensioner, I'm going to press the spring down and insert this wire to hold it in place until I can set it up in the chain guides. There. Put the spring tensioner in place, and with a little Loctite on the bolt, thread that guy in there. Before I tighten that bolt right up, I'm going to pull that little wire that's holding the spring back out of there. Let the spring tension up, and then I can torque that bolt down. Good to go. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is install the upper chain guides on the front. So the rear upper chain guide is going to go in like this, and this part is going to go behind the bottom chain guide. So line that up behind there, and then the rear one gets the shorter mounting bolt. I'll just thread into that guy. And same thing on the front, just goes in like that, and it gets the longer retaining bolt. And these guys are going to get torqued up to 17.5 foot-pounds, which is 210 inch-pounds. Okay, so it's the same procedure for the rear piston cam chains. I got the piston at top dead center. The mark on the gear is in line with the mark on the crankcase. I got 2 marks on my chain. This mark is lined up with the gear mark, and then I'll line up the mark down here with the crankshaft sprocket. Okay, and it's a really similar procedure for these rear chain guides. The front lower rear chain guide has an R on it, and I'll just slide in from the top right to there. Rear one. Oops. Sit in there like that. Lock tight on the bolts.